It began with a whisper, a strange prayer, symbols carved into the soles of feet, eyes that refused to turn toward the fire temple. Then people started disappearing. No bodies, no graves, just flecks of blood on the altar steps, and the scent of ash drifting through the wind. In a forgotten village on the empire's edge, a child woke in the night to find his father hanging upside down from the sacred pole, mouth sewn shut with threads of molten copper. The crime, singing an old hymn to the wrong god. This was not a war between kings. It was a war between gods. In ancient Iran, under the might of the Achaemenid Empire, religion wasn't just belief. It was fire. It was law. It was the reason a man could be burned alive to the cheers of the faithful. They burned a woman for hiding a forbidden book. They castrated men to purify heretical blood. They turned nonconformists into public warnings, monuments of fear carved in flesh. Who were these hunted people? Why were they seen as such a threat, and why even now, more than 2,000 years later, do their cries still feel like echoes from the ground beneath our feet? This isn't a story about armies. It's a story about faith, about power, about what happens when religion becomes a weapon, and when silence becomes the loudest act of defiance. What you're about to hear is true, and you won't believe it all started with a prayer. In the 6th century BCE, while much of Europe was still shrouded in tribal mysticism and fragmented gods, an empire rose in the east that would come to define the ancient world, not just through military might, but through the terrifying unity of law, religion, and divine kingship. It was the Achaemenid Empire, ancient Iran, under the rule of Cyrus the Great, followed by Darius the Fourth and their heirs. Sprawling across deserts, mountains, and river valleys, the empire was the beating heart of civilization. It boasted paved roads that stretched over 1,000 miles, monumental palaces, plated in gold, and a bureaucratic system far ahead of its time. But beneath the elegance of Persepolis, beneath the majesty of court rituals and royal edicts, something darker pulsed through its core, a faith that did not tolerate rivals. At the center of Achaemenid identity was Zoroastrianism, the worship of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light, order, and truth. It was a religion of fire purity, and duality, light versus darkness, good versus evil, order versus chaos. But this wasn't just theology, it was state doctrine. And like all doctrines sanctioned by thrones, it demanded obedience. Ahura Mazda's enemy, Angra Mainyu, wasn't just a demonic force. He was a symbol. Any opposing belief, any ancient rite, any whisper of older gods could be labeled his influence. To challenge the religious order wasn't just heresy, it was cosmic treason. And only one man had the divine right to define what was good and what was evil: the king. In the Achaemenid world, the King of Kings ruled not just with swords, but with sanctity. He was chosen by the heavens. His laws were the will of God. And deviation from that will, even in thought, even in private, was a threat to the entire cosmic order. To enforce this, there were the magus, the priestly class, who controlled the flame temples, administered rituals, and kept the purity laws. They were powerful, feared. They determined what was clean, what was corrupt, what could be said, and what must be buried. Their robes were symbols of authority, but also instruments of surveillance. Faith was no longer a sanctuary. It became a leash. Those who lived on the margins, ethnic minorities, village shamans, old women who still whispered to vanished gods, were left with a choice: conform or vanish. But not everyone vanished. In a remote region of the empire in the western hills, where the rivers ran slower and the mountains held secrets, a name began to surface in hushed tones: Anahita. No one knew if that was truly her name, or if it was given to her in reverence borrowed from the ancient goddess of water and fertility. What mattered was that she existed, and more importantly, that she was not afraid. She was not a warrior. She held no scroll, no title, no followers in uniform. She did not preach in temples. She did not curse the king. She did not light the holy flame, but she listened, and she healed. It is said that she helped women give birth beneath trees away from the temple's eyes, that she spoke blessings in dialects no longer written, that her hands could ease fever without invoking Ahura Mazda's name, that she remembered the gods the empire tried to erase. And when people disappeared, people who had been condemned for holding old texts, for refusing the royal fire, those who survived sought her. To the Magus, she was not just a woman. She was a symbol. And symbols, especially those that rise without banners, without swords, are the most dangerous of all. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be bribed. And when they're loved, they cannot be erased quietly. So the priests began to watch. The whispers were written down, and in the gold-lined corridors of Persepolis, behind carved walls and veils of incense, a decision was made. A woman was going to die. But not just for what she did, for what she refused to become. The village was called Mazarak, nestled in the western hills, where the empire's roads thinned and its fire temples stood quieter. Time moved differently there. The crops bowed, not just to the sun, but to ancient blessings whispered into the wind. In Mazarak, God still had names no priest dared to speak aloud. And in the center of that silence stood a woman, Anahita. She was not a prophet. She wore no royal blood. But she carried something far more dangerous: devotion, unbound by fear. Anahita didn't rally crowds or burn scrolls. She offered herbal pastes, chanted lullabies older than Zoroaster, held the hands of grieving mothers at twilight. People called her healer, midwife, guardian of old truths. And while they spoke her name in gratitude, the Magus began to speak it in reports, signed and red wax sealed for the highest ranks of Persepolis. The alarm wasn't public. No royal decree denounced her. That would grant her legitimacy. Instead, 3 magi were dispatched in silence. No army, no procession. Just 3 men in white robes with the power to interrogate, detain, and purify by fire. They carried a single scroll with the king's signet and a list of laws she had never officially broken, but would be punished for all the same. They arrived at dusk, just as the last of the sun's light bled out behind the hills. The villagers pretended not to notice. They kept their doors closed. No greetings, no candles in the windows. But the Magi made their presence known by hanging the sigil of purity in the village square, a silver pendant bearing the sacred flame. Its meaning was clear: heretics live among you. The next morning the questioning began. No torture, not yet. Just whispers turned into confessions. Who had seen Anahita? What had she said? Did she speak of Ahura Mazda, or of other things? The villagers said little. They feared their own answers more than any punishment. But fear, like smoke, has a way of curling into every crack. Then they found the children. 4 of them nestled in a cave beyond the village stream, singing softly in a forgotten tongue. Their voices echoed off the stone light as dust. When questioned, they said, "She taught us these songs to chase away nightmares." They did not cry when taken. Perhaps they didn't understand. Or perhaps they'd already seen what fear looks like in a child's eyes. That evening, the eldest boy's eyes were returned to the village in a bowl of polished stone. No words, no message, just blood and silence. Panic didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like frost claiming a window pane. Doors were barricaded. Wells were abandoned. No one spoke Anahita's name aloud anymore, not in warning, not in prayer. But in the silence, the Magi heard their answer: loyalty that would not break. On the 3rd day, a man gave in. A farmer recently widowed with a daughter the same age as one of the missing boys. He confessed. He spoke of the waterfall above the thicket, the cave hidden behind it. He said Anahita went there to pray alone to gods the priest no longer allowed. That night, the three magi climbed the slope beneath a full moon. They carried no torches. The wind did not stir. And when they reached the cave, they found her not fleeing, not hiding, but seated cross-legged on damp stone, hands in her lap, eyes closed. She did not run. She did not speak. They bound her wrists in cords of salted leather and walked her through Mazarak, as if she were already dead. No one stopped them. No one threw stones. But every window they passed carried eyes, wide, wet, waiting. No one wept aloud. That would be remembered. Instead, the village mourned in a silence so deep it felt like a storm had passed through and left no wind behind. She was taken to Persepolis. There was no trial in the open courts, no defenders, no crowd. Her crimes were read before a panel of Magus elders in a chamber perfumed with burning cedar. They said she had desecrated the purity laws, that she spread rituals not of the flame, that she rejected the light. She said nothing until they asked her to swear loyalty to Ahura Mazda and renounce her practices. Then softly, "Since when does light need to be forced through fire?" A guard later claimed that at that very moment the torches in the chamber flickered violently. Another swore they went out entirely. But such claims were dismissed as nervous superstition. The sentence was immediate ritual purification through public flame. But this would not be an execution. This would be a warning. They built the pyre not in secret, but at the heart of the capital, in the civic square of Unity, where royal decrees were once proclaimed, and enemy kings paraded in chains. The execution platform was decorated not with chains, but with garlands of flowers to remind the people this was not punishment, but restoration. A spiritual cleansing. The crowd gathered, not in celebration, not in hatred, but in compulsion. This was state religion as performance. Attendance was expected. Children stood on shoulders. Elders bowed heads. Foreign ambassadors looked on from carved balconies, unsure whether this was justice or theater. Anahita was led forward in a white robe, wrists unbound barefoot. She walked calmly, eyes forward, mouth closed. The square was so silent that the creak of wood under her steps seemed to scream. They asked if she had final words. She looked up, not at the priests, not at the fire, but at the sky. And she said, "You cannot burn what does not belong to this world." They bound her to the post, poured oil at her feet. The high Magus raised his staff, and the match was lit. The flame hesitated. For a moment it was as if the fire itself feared what it had been asked to do. The oil ignited with a low hiss, licking the edges of the pyre. Smoke spiraled upward slow at first, like a breath being drawn in. Anahita did not scream. The crowd expected it. Some dreaded it, others braced for the sound. But when none came, they leaned forward. Even the high Magus lowered his staff a fraction. Her body stood still. The flames curled around the base of the wood, kissing her feet, then crawling upward like vines, summoned by a vengeful sun. Still, she did not cry out. A hush spread across the square, deeper than silence. It was the sound of thousands witnessing something they could not name. The fire moved higher, dancing over her robe, now blackening and curling at the hem. Her hair began to shimmer in the heat strands, twisting like silver wires. Then came the smell, burnt oil, fabric, and something else, something deeply human. The scent of mortality peeled back layer by layer. A man near the front vomited. A woman clutched her infant closer, though the child had not moved. Even the guards averted their eyes, not because of horror, but because she refused to give them what they came for. She would not scream. As the fire reached her waist, her hands, once clasped in prayer, relaxed. Her lips parted. For a moment, it looked as though she was about to sing. And then the wind changed. A gust rose not from the east where the mountains stood, but from beneath. Dust lifted across the square. The flames recoiled, dancing sideways, flickering against the ropes that bound her. Sparks spun upward like fireflies fleeing the ground. Then came the sound, not from her, but from the crowd. A whisper. One voice, then another, soft, too soft to identify, but unmistakably words, phrases passed mouth to mouth like a secret too heavy to keep. Old prayers long banned rising like mist. The priests panicked. One, Magus, shouted for silence. Another raised a censer, swinging it in violent circles. A third ordered archers to be placed at the edge of the square. But it was too late. The people were not rebelling. They were remembering. Anahita turned her head slightly. Her eyes, though blistered, locked onto a figure in the crowd, a child. The same boy they had taken from the cave. He was alive, clutching a wooden charm in his hand. His mouth moved in rhythm with the old song. She smiled. And then the fire took her. The flames, perhaps angered by her defiance, surged upward with sudden fury. Her body arched, not in agony, but as if lifting. A halo of smoke surrounded her head and then collapse. Wood snapped. The ropes gave way. Her body fell, swallowed by fire, consumed in a final wave of orange and black, and silence followed. But it was not the same silence as before. This one was holy. No cheer, no declaration of victory, no reading of justice served. The High Magus turned and walked away without a word. The guards extinguished the pyre, not with urgency, but with fear, as if they too feared what they had helped to unearth. By nightfall, her ashes were swept away. No urn, no grave, no prayer. But the people remembered. In the weeks that followed, the whispering grew, at first in markets, then in temples, then in homes where the fire had long since gone cold. They spoke not of rebellion, but of her silence, her strength, her final smile. They called her the woman who burned without burning. They said her soul had not risen, but returned to the rivers, to the hills, to the mouths of children who now sang in secret. And then something strange happened. Magus patrols were sent to Mazarak, but the village was empty. No blood, no bodies, no sign of struggle. Just silence and a waterfall that, according to one report, ran backward for a full day. No one could explain it. The High Council dismissed it as myth, but they stopped speaking her name, even in warning. The temple where she had been sentenced caught fire 1 year later. No survivors, no known cause. By royal decree, her memory was forbidden. Her likeness, if ever found, was to be destroyed. Possession of songs linked to her was punishable by death. But the songs did not die. They traveled. On the tongues of traitors, carved into the undersides of bowls, scratched behind stone tablets. They were never sung loud, never written plainly, but they lived. And in every one of them there was a single line repeated like a heartbeat. You cannot burn what does not belong to this world. History did not weep for Anahita. No royal scribe recorded her name. No monument was built to mark her death. No elegy was sung in the court of Persepolis. She vanished from the official record as though she had never existed. But erasure, like fire, leaves behind traces. Centuries passed. Empires fell. Languages died. Temples turned to dust. Yet in remote regions of what is now Iran, small clues lingered, so small that they were easy to miss until someone knew where to look. In one mountain village, an archaeologist found a flat stone tucked beneath the foundation of an abandoned home. On its underside, barely visible after hundreds of years, were carvings, the shape of a woman with her hands lifted to the sky, surrounded by drops perhaps meant to be rain, or tears, or blood. In a collapsed cave sanctuary hundreds of miles away, a fragment of a clay tablet was discovered. It held just one sentence, not in Old Persian, not in Aramaic, but in a dialect that scholars struggled to identify. The line was eventually translated by a linguist familiar with ancient hymns. It read, "She gave us silence instead of fire." The references were scattered, but they all pointed to the same myth: a woman who did not scream, a woman who smiled into the flames, a woman who taught that purity was not obedience but compassion. Some believed she never existed. that she was a symbolic figure, a cautionary tale, or worse, a convenient fiction. But legends rarely survive across millennia unless they speak to something people needed to believe in or remember. Among underground mystics, her name resurfaced again in the late Sasanian period. In coded texts and forbidden rituals, she was called the Flame Bride, not because she burned, but because she wed herself to truth without flinching. In Zoroastrian texts from that same era, a curious pattern emerged, an uptick in references to false healers, forest women, and those who smile in the face of flame, but never by name, always as warnings, shadows. The kind you fear because they are hard to hold down. By the time Islam reached the region, her memory had long faded from the mouth of power, but not from the people. In whispers at wells and lullabies, in carved amulets passed from mother to daughter, fragments of her story survived. A tale of a woman who would not kneel, of a trial without witnesses, of a flame that consumed everything, except her soul. Today we may never know the full truth of who Anahita was. There are no portraits, no scrolls in her hand, no bones to bury. But perhaps her power lay not in what she left behind, but in what she refused to leave broken. Her legacy is not measured in temples or tombs. It lives in the act of resistance that leaves no sound, only impact. In the voice that says no, not with anger, not with violence, but with the kind of stillness that kings cannot touch. And that legacy is not unique to her. Across history, again and again, we see the same pattern. Nameless women, quiet, rebels forgotten, heretics, those who are burned by fear but remembered by courage. Those who vanish from the record but rise in memory like smoke curling into a sky that no one can censor. Anahita's story may be dust, but dust, after all, is what survives fire. And sometimes dust is where seeds take root. She didn't leave behind an army, or scriptures, or monuments of stone, but she left something stronger, a story, one that refused to burn, one that lived through silence, through whispers, through the trembling hands of those who carried her name only in the backs of their minds, afraid to speak it, but unable to forget. If her death moved you, if her defiance haunted you, then you're not alone. And she wasn't either. Because what happened to Anahita wasn't isolated. In the shadows of history there are others, other women, other voices, other flames. If you thought this was horrifying, wait until you learn what was done to the prophetess they buried alive for refusing to kneel to a child king. Click here to uncover that story. And if you believe these voices deserve to be heard even centuries too late, subscribe. You'll be helping us bring the erased back into the light. After all, some stories were never meant to die.